I could hardly believe my eyes when I first read his review. Derivative, contrived, uninspired. My blood practically boiled with rage. Little did I know how far those words would take me. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Eleanor, and if you're familiar with the art world, there's a good chance you've come across my work before, perhaps in a museum or an exhibition. I'm a well-established artist, primarily known for my watercolor landscapes, though lately, I've been experimenting with something different. For the past 2 decades, I've lived in a secluded cabin on the outskirts of Douglas County, Oregon. It doubles as my makeshift studio, a space where I can create in peace. I don't mean to sound withdrawn or unapproachable. It's just the environment where I thrive. A brush in hand, a blank canvas before me, and no one around to make small talk. That's how I operate best. Though, I'll admit, the solitude can get overwhelming at times. With no close family left, and most of my friends being similar tortured genius loner types, I rarely engage in social outings. Maybe that's why his review hit me so hard. Caleb Whitmore, one of the most esteemed art critics of our time, and yet, for reasons unknown, he has always had a personal vendetta against my work. Even before I dared to push artistic boundaries, he dismissed my paintings. Ugly faux cubist garbage, he wrote this time, completely missing the essence of what I was trying to achieve. His words haunted me, circling through my mind on an endless loop, and the frustration built up inside me until it became unbearable. In a fit of anger, I seized a brush and attacked the nearest canvas, hurling paint across its surface with reckless abandon. It was chaotic, raw, and violent. Yet, somehow, when I stepped back, I saw something impressionistic in the madness. Exhausted, I collapsed into bed, but sleep refused to come. His harsh critique had embedded itself deep into my already fragile confidence. Even at my lowest, I had always clung to my art and reputation. Now, both felt as if they were crumbling. By morning, a new thought had taken root in my mind. If Caleb was so certain about his judgment, then let him say it to my face. I would invite him to my studio for a private exhibition and interview. Perhaps I could persuade him to reconsider, or, at the very least, get him to utter a single positive word about my work. And, if I was being honest with myself, the company wouldn't hurt either. Some might call it pathetic, seeking human interaction from my harshest critic. They wouldn't be wrong. But at that moment, I didn't care. Fueled by lingering frustration, I scribbled down my invitation, gripping the pen tighter than necessary. Then, without giving myself time to second-guess the decision, I drove into town and mailed the letter. On the way back, doubt started creeping in. Had I just made a fool of myself? Was this nothing more than a desperate attempt to bribe a critic into changing his stance? I shook off the thought. No, this was just a friendly conversation. A couple of drinks, nothing more. The following weeks passed agonizingly slowly, filled with sleepless nights and relentless work. I poured every ounce of my energy into new paintings, desperately trying to create something he might actually like. Then finally, his response arrived. I gladly accept your invitation. However, I must clarify that I do not expect this interview or exhibition to change my opinion of your previous work. I do not take well to bribery or flattery. I will be there on Tuesday at 7 o'clock in the evening. I scanned the calendar on my wall. Tuesday. Today. Panic set in. The letter must have been delayed in the mail. Just my luck. I had less than an hour to clean up and prepare for what could be the most important interview of my career. The cabin was a disaster, torn apart by 2 weeks of nonstop painting. As for myself, I wasn't exactly in a presentable state. Faded mom jeans, an old sweater splattered with paint, and my hair twisted into a messy bun. Hardly the professional look I had envisioned. I sprang into action, gathering scattered canvases, paint buckets, and newspaper clippings and shoving them into the nearest closet without any real organization. There was no time for perfection, only damage control. I had barely finished when a knock echoed through the cabin. My heart pounded. I hadn't spoken to another person in weeks. What was I supposed to say? I didn't even know what he looked like. In my mind, I had pictured a cold, bespectacled art snob, thin, balding, exuding an air of superiority. But when I finally opened the door, I was taken aback. The man standing before me appeared to be in his late 20s, at least 3 decades younger than I had imagined. He was tall but more lanky than imposing, with unruly hair that nearly obscured his face. A pair of tortoiseshell glasses rested at the tip of his nose, and, to my surprise, he was actually cute. The glasses didn't quite suit him, but that was an easy fix. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other, caught in an unexpected realization. He must have assumed I was some elderly woman, not the woman standing before him. I may be 55, but I certainly don't look it, and my casual, paint-stained attire likely didn't help. After what felt like an eternity, he finally extended his hand, offering a dry, sarcastic smile. Caleb Whitmore. Charmed, I'm sure. His voice carried an air of forced confidence, a thin veil over what I recognized as nervousness. I had met plenty of men like him before, critics who wielded words like weapons, but lost their bravado in person. Eleanor Voss. Not remotely, I replied, shaking his hand with an assertive grip. You're a lot younger than I expected, I added, tilting my head slightly in curiosity. He visibly flinched, struggling for a response. Well, you're a lot, he started, then abruptly cut himself off, realizing what he was about to say. His gaze darted away, embarrassment flickering across his face. Annoyed but also somewhat amused, I decided to let it slide. Instead, I held onto his hand just a moment too long, watching as the discomfort settled in before finally releasing my grip and motioning for him to come inside. He stepped in, scanning the cabin with a keen, critical eye, searching for imperfections. But there was nothing for him to pick apart, at least not until his gaze landed on something. The painting I had created in the heat of my frustration, propped against a chair. I had completely forgotten about it. This one wasn't part of the exhibition, he mused, approaching the canvas. Before I could come up with an excuse, he spoke again, his tone unexpectedly reverent. It's fantastic, he said, much to my disbelief. A real explosion of color, undeniably influenced by Pollock, yet distinctly your own. I blinked, stunned. Was he serious? A nervous chuckle escaped my throat. You're joking, I muttered. His silence told me otherwise, and for a moment I just stood there, underdressed, unprepared, and feeling utterly exposed under his scrutinizing gaze. Was he toying with me? He knew how much his opinion mattered. What's it called? He asked, removing his glasses and sweeping the unruly hair from his face. With nothing obstructing my view, I suddenly saw him differently. Without the glasses and the messy hair, he was actually quite handsome. It had been a long time since anyone had made me feel this way, and though I hated to admit it, it was exhilarating. The silence stretched too long, so I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. Review. A smirk played at the corner of his lips, and for the first time that night, the tension between us eased. Fitting, he murmured, amusement flickering in his eyes. Deciding to make things more comfortable, I led him to the living room, where I lit the fireplace and brewed 2 cups of ginger tea. I was a fan of your earlier work, simple but comforting, familiar. So, what led to this sudden change in style? I let his words settle as I sipped my tea, its warmth doing little to ease the frustration bubbling inside me. Simple, comforting, familiar. Each term stung more than the last, and I was more than ready to show him why. Throughout my career, those were the words used to describe me. Never bold, never innovative, always just familiar. It was infuriating. In an industry that already made it difficult for older women to be taken seriously, I had carved out a successful career. I had made my money, secured my place, but that wasn't enough. I needed to prove that I was capable of more than the safe, expected pieces everyone associated with me. Do you ever feel that way, Mr. Whitmore? That you need to prove yourself? I asked, watching him carefully. He considered his response before answering. A critic doesn't need to prove anything. Their job is simply to push others to do better. His words lingered between us, and for a moment, guilt settled in. After all, whether I liked it or not, his review had driven me to create more than I ever had before, even if my motivation had been pure rage. I'm sorry if my words were harsh, he admitted, voice softer than I expected. But I think they were necessary, and for what it's worth, age has never factored into my critiques. If it ever felt like it did, then I apologize. For the first time that evening, I felt his eyes truly see me, not just glance past me like a subject to be examined. It was almost ridiculous that I had dreaded this meeting so much when, in reality, it felt good, human, to speak so openly. Thank you, Caleb. That means a lot, I said with a small smile. It was the least I could do. As the hours passed, our conversation drifted further from the structured interview and more toward an easy, natural exchange. It was as if we had known each other for years. He spoke about his journey into art criticism, his childhood, his inspirations. In return, I told him about my own beginnings, the places I had called home, the artists who had shaped me. Before I knew it, the night had stretched long, and reality crept back in. He stood, slipping his glasses back on and heading for the door. I should be going, it's getting late. I hesitated. Some part of me wasn't ready to end the night just yet. You could always stay, I found myself saying. We could share a bottle of wine. It was a long shot, even to my own ears. But there was something between us, something I wasn't quite ready to let go of. Caleb paused, his hand hovering just shy of the doorknob. Then, slowly, he turned back to me, his lips curling into a genuine smile, one free from the sarcasm he had worn earlier. All right, he said simply. We sat together in the glow of the fire, the warmth flickering between us. He swirled his wine absently in his glass before speaking again. Forgive me for asking, but this is a rather large place for just one person. I exhaled a small laugh. Too large, if you ask me. Never been much of a people person, and I suppose that carried into my relationships. It was meant to be light-hearted, but the words came out sadder than I had intended. But I'm great, I added quickly, forcing a grin. I live for myself, and myself alone. The statement felt hollow. Caleb shifted slightly closer, the golden firelight casting shadows across his face. It must get a little lonely, surely. His voice was hesitant, as if he wasn't sure he should be asking. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and insistent, like the rhythmic pounding of a train on tracks. I hadn't expected any of this sudden electricity between us. And yet, here I was, twirling a loose strand of hair like a schoolgirl, unable to meet his gaze. I didn't answer his question. Instead, I changed the subject. I want to paint you. That caught his attention. He sat up straighter, intrigued. Really? For all the art I've critiqued? I've never actually been painted before. Well, then we'd better make it memorable. I positioned him opposite me, watching as he shrugged off his thick jacket. It was odd that he had kept it on this long, but underneath, he wore a fitted shirt with the top buttons undone. The fabric clung just enough to hint at the strength beneath. Lean, but defined. I hadn't painted a portrait in years, yet something about this moment felt inevitable. Like fate had delivered him right to my studio, challenging me to capture him. He sat with his arms crossed, legs tucked in, watching me work. As I sketched out his frame, the lines of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, I found myself asking him to shift closer, and closer still. I needed to get the details right, after all. When I reached his arms, I hesitated. Would you mind if I felt them? For accuracy, of course. His cheeks darkened, his gaze flickering away, but he gave a small nod. I traced my fingers over his forearm, feeling the tension beneath his skin. His breath, warm and steady, brushed against my temple. Slowly, deliberately, I let my hand drift to his chest. Is this still for the painting? He murmured, amusement lacing his words. I smirked, dragging my fingers up to his jawline. Of course, I need to understand my subject. He turned to face me fully, mere inches separating us now. And? Did you like what you found? I didn't bother answering. Instead, I reached for his glasses, carefully slipping them from his face before closing my eyes and leaning in. The moment our lips met, everything else faded. The self-doubt, the anxieties, the thoughts of what came next. We weren't artist and critic, older woman and younger man. We were just two people reaching for something real, and for one perfect night, we found it. By morning, he was gone. No note, no goodbye, not even a fleeting see you around. I should have expected it, but the absence still stung. One moment, he had given me something I hadn't felt in years. Connection, excitement, something raw and alive. And then, just as easily, he had vanished, leaving only questions in his wake. Had last night meant anything to him? Had I been a fool to trust him, a man who had once torn my work apart? Had I been used? For the next week, my emotions waged war within me. Gratitude for the night we had shared clashed against the bitterness of his departure. I was trying to make peace with it, until I noticed something. 2 of my paintings were missing. Review, and the unfinished portrait I had painted of him. Anger flared inside me. Was this something he did often? Did he always take souvenirs from his conquests? I was still fuming when a package arrived in the mail. Inside was a thick arts magazine, one I recognized as a respected publication. Confused, I flipped through the pages until I saw it, an essay, written by Caleb. It was a critique of my latest exhibition, and right there, printed in the center of the page, were the 2 missing paintings, Review and Reviewer. That was what he had titled the unfinished portrait of himself. My anger burned hot until I saw the rating. 5 stars. A monumental piece exploring the complex relationship between artist and critic. I eagerly await any future work from Miss Eleanor Voss. I stared, breath catching in my throat. I scanned the rest of the magazine, searching for some sign, some hidden meaning behind his words. And then, at the very back, I found it. A phone number, scrawled in blue ink with a small, smiley face beside it. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Huh, I murmured, a smirk tugging at my lips. Maybe he wasn't so bad after all.